We are going to be concluding John chapter 6 today. Did it not too long. It only took us, I think, about 5 weeks to get through John 6, so that's pretty good. This is going to be maybe a tough one, as you maybe can even tell by the title there. In these concluding verses of John, we're going to be looking at the hard gospel. And as I was kind of thinking on this this week, it dawned on me that I now believe that the gospel is hard, but I didn't always believe that. And I wonder, has there been? Certainly there has. Let me ask you not if there has been. Let me ask you to reflect on something in your life at some point or another where you had a certain perspective at one point, and then you remember it kind of radically changing at some point or another. Something that you believed, thought you knew about the world, thought you knew about life, whatever it is. I'm sure there's plenty of examples in parenting. I haven't been a parent long enough for anything to radically change. It still is like the easiest, most awesome job in the world. I can't imagine anything possibly going wrong, ever. But something along those lines. For me, I had one of these moments. I've had lots of them. I think it's good as we continue to grow and mature that we should. Our perspective should change. We should, be continually receiving more information, modifying the way we look at the world, the positions we hold, those sorts of things. And when it came to the gospel, I can remember as a young man and being a believer and fervently such, thinking to myself that the gospel, it was just way too easy. I just couldn't understand how something that was so eternally consequential, something that was so important, my eternal destiny, what was going to happen to my soul for forever, hinged on just this simple little act of faith. All I have to do is believe in Jesus and say a prayer, and then I get to be in heaven forever? Something doesn't seem right about this. It doesn't seem like there's much required for what's given. And then, of course, as I started to think about it more and more, and as I started to kind of grow and more life circumstances happened, I realized that actually coming to faith in Jesus and accepting the gospel is a really, really difficult thing to do. Because it requires that you die to yourself. The gospel requires that you take everything in your natural self, in your natural mind, in your body. You take all of those things and you put them to death. And this is what Jesus said. This is what we all read together in Matthew 16. And in verse 24, it says, Jesus told his disciples, if anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So it is this strange paradox. There are so many of them in Scripture and in theology, where as we are coming to the Lord to receive life, we are actually dying at the same time. We are dying to our flesh, and we are being born again in our spirit man, and that is exactly what is required of the gospel. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, quite famous for this quote, he said, when God calls a man, he bids him to come and die. And that is the message of the gospel, that if you want to come to Jesus, you must die. He is coming to shake up all of the things in your life, all of the things that you have been holding on to, clinging on to. There's a little kind of quote, something of a truism, and it says that Jesus came to comfort the afflicted. And we like that. Those of us who are feeling afflicted, Jesus came to comfort the afflicted, and he came to afflict the comfortable. That is to say that those who need comfort get comforted. But those who maybe need to have a little affliction, those who maybe need to be challenged and kind of prodded and kind of pruned and have some of the stuff trimmed off of their life. He came to do that as well. And that is part and parcel of the whole gospel. And it's one of the parts that's a little more difficult, I think, for all of us to come to terms with. But Jesus says again in Matthew 10:34, he says, "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." And the message that Jesus is putting across here is that in his mission, there is going to be division. There is going to be a separating of the wheat from the chaff, of the sheep from the goats, of the living from the dead, and of the righteous from the unrighteous. And this is what the gospel is. It is pruning what is dead and what is destructive from the earth and from each one of us. And this is what Jesus is all about. It is not an easy gospel at all, and Jesus had begun to communicate this in John chapter 6. If you remember last week when we covered a record-breaking 30-some verses in a single sitting. And what we have going on here today is the result of that little sermon that Jesus gave, where he compared himself to the bread, called himself the bread of life, said that you had to eat his flesh and drink his blood. And everyone was thinking, what is this guy talking about? And we pick up today in verse 60 where we had left off last week. And this is how it goes. On hearing it, that is what Jesus had just got done saying in the previous 30 verses, many of his disciples said, "This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?" Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, "Does this offend you? Then what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you, they are full of spirit and life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe." For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. He went on to say, "This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them." And from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. "You do not want to leave too, do you?" Jesus asked the 12. Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God." And then Jesus replied, "Have I not chosen you, the 12? Yet one of you is a devil." He meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, who, though one of the 12, was later to betray him. So, this is our text for today, and we are going to move through this quickly. And I think that it is important to note right from the beginning that there is a distinction to be made between the disciples and the 12. We very often think that when it talks about Jesus' disciples, the very first thing that we think about is the 12 disciples. I can't name them all. I would. I usually get 11, and there's one that I forget all the time. And I wouldn't even try. But Jesus had many disciples. And as we saw when he was feeding the 5,000, we know that he was drawing at least crowds of thousands, and presumably some of those would decide that they wanted to hear more and see more, and they would begin to follow Jesus, and they became his disciples. There was still an inner circle of the 12, and then even within those 12, there was another inner circle of the 3, of Peter, James, and John. However, Jesus had many people following him from time to time. We know that after his death, burial, and resurrection, there were 120 disciples who were in the upper room and in that area on the day of Pentecost. So there were lots that came and went during Jesus' ministry, and it is kind of that idea that we're talking about today, the coming and going of people who follow Jesus. So there is a distinction to be made. Just know right here that when it's talking about the disciples, that's not necessarily talking about the 12. When John wants to refer to the 12, he says specifically the 12. And the it of verse 60 is, of course, the words of Jesus from verses 25 to 59, where Jesus calls himself the bread of life and then tells his disciples that they must eat him. So they hear this and they're very troubled. And they say that these are very hard words, and then people decide, I don't want to follow Jesus anymore. And it brings up the point that Jesus' works were attractive, but his words were not. People were attracted to his works, but his words seemed to turn people off. They would come for the miracles, they would come for the food, but then when it came time for the preaching and for the teaching, and for him to tell them difficult things like, I've come not to bring peace but a sword. If you want to be my disciple, you must take up your cross and die. It is not going to be an easy and a painless journey to follow me. Saying things like the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And if you follow me, you will be in that same category. He starts to say all of these things, and people begin to turn away. It's a pretty effective way of seeing who's really serious about what's going on and who's just there for the benefits, something that we talked about last week. So, his miracles would draw crowds of thousands, but his teachings seemed to drive away about the same amount. So do a miracle, thousands of people come out, start teaching interesting and controversial things, and everyone goes away. But what's really interesting to me as I was thinking about this is you have the words in the works people like. They didn't like the words. But in John chapter 1, when we started, if you can remember back months and months ago, it says that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And you have something of this sort of kind of a synonymous understanding here of word and flesh. And the people said, this is a really hard word. And if you think of Jesus' word being the same as his flesh, he is the embodiment of who God is, of everything that God is. Then what Jesus is saying in saying that you have to take my flesh, you have to eat my flesh and take it into you, then what he's saying is you have to take my word into you. You have to take my words into you. You have to take my teaching into you. And in the same way that physical bread provides physical sustenance, this spiritual bread, my word, me, I provide spiritual sustenance. So the physical sustains the physical, and the spiritual sustains the spiritual. So there's a corollary there between Jesus' words and his flesh, and they must both be taken in. But both of those things were found to be hard. In verse 60, they say, this is a hard teaching. And this is a great opportunity to do a fun little word study. I had told some of you on Wednesday that I just got picked up by New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, where I attained my degrees from, to teach Greek. We're going to find out how well I really know it soon. So I'll take all the practice I can get. And I just think it's fun. I hope that you enjoy this. Some people, it's controversial. They say, should you use Greek in your sermons? Is it like showing off or something? Are you like trying to it's like, I'm not showing off. I just think it's fascinating. And I think that if I think it's fascinating, there's some of you that do too. But this is the Greek word. It is skleros in the Greek. And it actually, words, we've talked about this before, don't have literal meanings, right? There's not one definition that you can say, this is the definition of that word. Language changes, it evolves over time. So with words, what you have is a semantic range, it's called. It can mean this or this or this or this or this. You can do it with almost every single word. You can think of any word and think of multiple different definitions for it. What's interesting is that in the Hebrew mind, and you remember we're talking about, even though this is the New Testament, and even though it's written in Greek, it's written by Jews. So it is Jewish thinking that is being communicated to us from start to finish in the Bible. It is Jewish minds, Jewish authors, Jewish thinking. And in the Jewish and Hebrew mind, whereas we search for a great degree of certainty and finality in all things in the West, in the East it wasn't always like that. In the East, especially in language, there is great freedom for nuance and for double entendre. And for a lot of times when you have a word that has a multiplicity of meanings, sometimes it can't be discerned which one of the definitions it is that fits best in this circumstance, because they all do. And that's something of the beauty of language from the East, is that it is a lot more robust. Whereas in the West, we try to be very precise. In the East, it's much more picturesque and kind of leaves a lot for you to kind of process. And in them saying that this is hard, it's a hard teaching, the Greek word that gets used there is skleros, and it can mean hard, as in what you might have been thinking that it means, difficult or rigorous. That is to say, this teaching, it is difficult for us to process, or it is going to be hard to walk out. It will be rigorous in order for us to do this. Or it can also mean hard in the sense of stiffness. Something that is hard, stubborn, unmoving, unyielding, unbudging. Something that cannot be plied or molded or shaped. It is hard. And I think that what's really interesting about the description that these certain disciples used of Jesus' teaching is that both of those definitions seem to fit here. And perhaps that was the intention of John when he put these words on the lips of those people. This definition works on both counts here. It is hard, the teaching of Jesus, whether you understand it too in the natural sense, the misunderstanding of it, where you say, we have to eat you? And they're misunderstanding it, and they're saying, this is difficult. And they actually ask, how is he going to give us his flesh to eat? That seems like a hard thing to do. And then even if he did do it, it wouldn't be the most fun thing. I'm not really entirely sure about cannibalism. It seems pretty awful and horrific, and I'm sure that it would be difficult to achieve. But also, if you understand this in the way that it should be, if you understand this, what Jesus is saying is you have to take me and my teachings into yourself, and particularly this teaching about my flesh and about my blood. That means that you have to participate with me in my death and in my suffering. That you must do what I am doing. That you must walk out the life that I am walking out. And if they were understanding it correctly, if they were seeing that he's alluding to his death, and he was saying, you must take this into you, then they're saying, well, that's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult to die, whether that be physically or whether that be spiritually, to die to myself. It's difficult in either way. And it's a hard message. And this is the hard message of the gospel, that you must take Jesus' life and his death into you. You have to take in his life, but you also have to take in his death. In 1 John 2:6, John says, whoever claims to live in him, Jesus, must walk as he did. If you claim to live in Jesus, you have to live the same sort of life that he did. And Paul, in Philippians 3:10, he says, I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his suffering, becoming like him in his death. So what Jesus is saying is that the bread of life, which he is offering, the life that he is offering as bread through his flesh, also requires death. To take in this life, you must die. So, it's a very difficult proposition for people. William Booth said it like this. He said, what is the use of preaching the gospel to men whose whole attention is concentrated upon a mad, desperate struggle to keep themselves alive? Because at the core of the gospel is the need to die. And what he is saying is, if we're talking to a bunch of people who are so concerned with feeding their flesh, with taking care of the desires of their physical body, whether that be through these people who were coming to Jesus just because they wanted to be fed, they were coming to find bread, that was the only reason they were there. They wanted to keep their physical bodies alive. Or whether that is because of any various number of pleasures, desires, addictions, lusts of the flesh that we continue to give ourselves over to willingly and repeatedly all the time. The question being asked here is, what is the point of even trying to communicate this message to people whose primary concern is to gratify their flesh? And that seems to be what Jesus was getting to in saying the things that he said. Because what he was saying is, if you want to feed your spirit, you'll hear these things and you'll press in more to find an answer. And if you're here only to feed your flesh, if you're here only to be comforted, then these sorts of things are going to turn you away. And this is the sword that he's talking about. This is the division that he's talking about. It should be pretty plain by now that we understand that walking as Jesus did, as we saw in that previous verse, means that we surrender the entirety of our life, both our mind, will, or rather all our mind, will, and emotions, to the Father, just as Jesus did. That we have to give up our independent autonomy. That to come into relationship with God, remember, Jesus came to show us what it is to be God and to show us what it is to be human. And what it is to be human is to live a life in complete surrender to the Father. And when you say that you want to come into fellowship with God, then what that means is you are taking all of your earthly, physical desires, all of the things that your deceitful, lying heart tells you that you want, and you are laying all of those things aside, and you are saying, God, I want only what you want. I want only what you want. I don't want any of these things that I thought that I want. There's the verse, and chapter and verse are going to fail me, but delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. You remember this? I was talking to a friend one time, and he was saying to me, he said, I don't even know what the desires of my heart are, because my heart is so twisted. And have you ever, I'm sure you all have had this happen to you before, where you think that you want something, and you work really hard to get it, and you put all your effort into it, and maybe there's a thing, a material possession, relationship, or whatever, and then you get that thing, and then all of a sudden you realize it's not really as great as I thought it was going to be. This isn't all that it was cracked up to be here. And you realize that your heart doesn't even actually know what it wants. And this is why when we delight ourselves in the Lord, he can give us the desires of his heart, because he becomes the desire of our heart. And so long as we are clinging on to the things that are not from him, then we will never find peace. We will never be in right relationship with God. As we give up our independence, there's a word that the Bible uses very often, and a lot of people don't like it, but it is slave. It is a way in which Paul refers to himself over and over and over again. You usually have it translated in most English translations of the Bible as bondservant, but the word is doulos, and it is slave. And Paul says that I am a slave to Christ. And slavery in the Bible, just a quick little side tangent, we won't take up too much time here. Slavery in the Bible, almost every single time that you see slavery in the Bible, we all realize that it is completely immoral and unethical. It really makes you wonder. We were talking about your perspective changing. It makes you wonder how throughout the entire world, through the entire history of the whole world, people have thought that it was okay to own other people as property. It has been common practice throughout the whole world. People have had slaves. The United States is very special, actually, in the fact that at some point we said, we probably should stop doing this. We probably shouldn't have slaves anymore. If people had been reading their Bibles, particularly Philemon, they would understand that slavery, whereas it is you go and buy a person as your own property, has never been tolerated in the scriptures. When it talks about slavery in the Bible, it's almost always indentured servitude, which means that a person put themselves into a situation where they accrued and acquired an extraordinary amount of debt which they became incapable of paying back. And in order to square things up with the person they owed the money to, they would offer themselves as a slave to that person. And they would say, I owe you such an incredible debt. I will never be able to repay it. Will you take me as your slave, and I will work for you and do for you whatever is required. And then in the Old Testament law, it said in under such circumstances, you would keep this person for 6 years, and then on the 7th year, the year of Jubilee, all the slaves were set free. So this person did do a certain amount of work to kind of repay this debt, although they didn't. And this is the kind of slavery. This is a picture of the gospel. We owe an incredible debt to God that we can never repay. He is holding the title deed for our debt, and we come to him and say, I will do whatever you tell me to do because I owe you this incredible debt. What's very interesting is that in Exodus chapter 21, there's actually this protocol for if a slave is with a family and decides that he actually really loves this family and wants to stay with this family, there's this ceremony that they do where the slave will go to his master and he will say, you have been a good debt holder for me. You have been fair to me. You have been kind. You've been gracious. You've treated me well as I have owed you this debt. Would you take me in to be a part of your family? And in Exodus 21, it gives the rules for how this is to happen. And the owner is supposed to take the slave to the doorpost of his home, and he is to take a nail and drive a nail through the earlobe of the slave and to drive that nail into the doorpost of the home. And you can see this is a covenant mark that is on display that lets everybody know that this person is now in right standing with their slave owner and that they now have become a part of the family. And this person who used to be a slave now becomes a son. And if you can't see the picture there of the gospel and of the nails piercing and the crucifixion, if you will, as we are crucified with Christ, we enter into sonship. And it is done at the doorway because that is the entrance into the family home, is in the doorway. So this incredible picture of this debt that is owed, and we must be crucified in order to come into the settling of that account. In Galatians 2:20, Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in this body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. So he said, I died with Jesus. That is what salvation is. I died with Jesus, and now I am brought into the family. So this teaching is hard, going back to this idea, because it's difficult to accept and live out. Nobody wants to die to themselves, but it is also hard in another way. And that second definition that we had of hard, it is stiff and unyielding and unbudging. It makes no compromises. It is black and white, dark and light, death and life. There are two choices and nothing in between. And we have talked about this before, and it is something that is difficult to walk in entirely and truly and fully here in this life, but there is right and wrong. There is light and darkness. There is righteousness and unrighteousness. God is not confused about those two things, no matter how much we might be. There's no in between. There is no straddling the fence, and at some point or another, you can't sit on the fence anymore. And this was the place that these disciples found themselves in. The ones who were following Jesus, and they're saying, we're not really sure exactly what's going on here with this guy, but the free food is cool, and the miracles are fun, but we don't really know exactly where we're at. And essentially, what was going on was Jesus was saying, it's time to know. You have to know. You don't get to have one foot on this side and one foot on the other side. I kind of struggle in my life with indecisiveness. Does anybody else struggle with indecisiveness? Like, it's so bad that it affects my Starbucks order. I mean it. I'll be standing in line at Starbucks or in the drive-thru. I'm on my way. I know I'm going to Starbucks to get a drink. And I'm thinking to myself, do I want a hot or a cold drink? I love hot drinks in the morning. If I haven't had a hot drink in the morning, then I want a hot one. But it's so hot outside right now that is it even going to be enjoyable to drink a hot drink? I feel like I want one, but should I get an iced drink? But then if I get an iced drink, do I want an iced coffee or a tea? And I sit and I really, really think about it. And I'm thinking, which one do I want? I only get one drink. I'm only getting one drink. I better make it a good one. And I really struggle. And I'll be it's horrible. It happens to me all the time, especially when I'm in line, in person in the store, and I am waiting at the counter, and then I get up to the counter, and then they're like, hey, welcome to Starbucks. What can I get for you? And I'm just like, There's like a bunch of people behind you, too. And they're like, haven't you been standing in line for like 5 minutes? And then I have to go through the whole thing, and I usually say it out loud to the person. I'm like, I don't know if I want a hot or a cold drink. And they're like, well. And then they give me their opinion, but I'm like, but you're not drinking the drink, though. I am. And it gets really... It's really a thing for me. And you get to the point where you just got to make a choice. And you just have to decide, all right, well, I'm going to make this choice, and I'm going to live with the consequences of stinking hot cappuccino with, I don't even know, but however it goes. Whatever drink I order, I'm stuck with it. And that's kind of the way that it is in life. There's this great commitment in not commit, or great comfort rather, in not committing to things. Don't you like to have options? I love options. I don't do good with them because it's confusing for me at the same time, but also comforting. I love to have exit plans anytime I'm going anywhere. If I have come to hang out with any of you and have dinner at your house or do anything, I have had an exit plan. Just in case I needed it. Most of the time I don't. I really enjoy spending time with all of you. But I'm thinking, just in case, and now that you have a baby, it's great. Of course, you have to leave him at home because he's never fussy, so you can't be like, oh, the baby's fussy, we got to go. But if he's not there, then you can be like, oh, yeah, got a text, I got to go. But I always have one because it's nice to have options. But when you don't have options anymore, there is something that really it feels restrictive. It feels like it confines you. You want the freedom, to live your life however you want to, but you also want the comfort of knowing that you're secure in Christ. And the problem is that what Jesus tells us over and over and over again in the gospel is you don't get to have both. You cannot eat your cake and have it too. Or perhaps we should say, eat your bread and have it too. That actually is the proper, in case any of you are wondering, isn't it have your cake and eat it too? It is actually eat your cake and have it too, is the way that it is supposed to be said, because you cannot take it into you and then still have it. You can have it and then take it into you, but you can't take it into you and then still have it. And this is the thing. We want to enjoy the benefit of Jesus, but we don't want to take him into ourselves. We want all of the benefit, but we don't want any of the hard work that goes along with it. And this kind of difficulty that people have with commitment, it's showing all over the place in our culture today as people are less and less entering into marriage and children and those sorts of things. I hear more and more. I was just talking with somebody up at the state convention about getting our tax stuff in order, which is coming. It's almost done. And he was telling me that he has 2 sons about my age, and they have both decided that they just aren't going to have kids. Too big a commitment. Will interfere with their lives. And I just thought to myself, oh my goodness. The benefit does not outweigh the difficulty there. You love your life just the way that it is so much that you don't want to have a progeny. And this is what people struggle with all the time. And with marriage. And people think oh, this person's pretty great, but do I want them forever? What's really interesting is we see this in the Bible in Matthew chapter 19. And the Pharisees are coming and they're asking Jesus because it had become part of the kind of tradition of the time that a man could put away his wife for almost anything. All the way down to she burned your dinner. This is written in the Midrash that if she burns your dinner, you can divorce her. And the Pharisees come to Jesus and they ask, what's the deal with this? When is it permissible to divorce your wife? And then, of course, Jesus says to them, he says, it's only permissible ever in the case of infidelity is the only time that it's permitted. And he says, and it always hasn't been that way. Marriage is a representation of the covenant that we enter into with God, and it is irrevocable. But what Jesus says is because the Lord is sympathetic to our hearts, and because that can be such an egregious offense, he says it is permitted in that instance, but it is not required. It is not demanded. What is better is that you forgive as your Father has forgiven you, and you offer reconciliation and restoration, and you move forward. So Jesus tells the Pharisees, there is no easy way out of marriage, actually. And then the disciples, this is so great, their response in verse 10. The disciples said to him, if this is the situation between a husband and a wife, it's better not to marry. They said, wait, we can't just divorce our wife if we don't like her anymore? Jesus said, no, that's not the way it works. You entered into a commitment. You have to live it out. And they said, it's better probably just not to do that. And then Jesus replied, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. And these are the same words that we see in chapter 6. In verse 60 that the disciples say, it's a really hard teaching, and the same response that we see from Jesus in verse 65. It is hard, and it can only be done if it is given by the Father. That these difficult things that you are being asked to do can only be done if the Father grants it to you. In verse 65, he went on to say, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them. And coming to salvation is, in fact, so difficult. I used to think that it was easy, but it is so difficult that it actually requires an act of God. That's how hard it is to come to faith in Jesus. It requires an act of God. It is not something that we can do on our own. And I don't want to, once again, jump into the conversation about God's sovereignty and our responsibility. We will have the full discussion at some point. It's not today. I'm going to tell you this. I believe that God is in control of every single thing that happens in the universe. He's in control of everything. Which means that every single circumstance in your life has happened. Everything has happened under the purview of God. And if he has not made the thing to happen, at the very least he has allowed the thing to happen, which if he could have stopped it and did not stop it and allowed it to happen, then he's still responsible for it. So everything is happening in accordance with God's plan. Yet, as Paul talks about in Romans, we still do not get to point a finger at God and say, I didn't have any other choice because of, look at my circumstances. And if what you're saying is that nobody can come to the Father unless they're to the Son, unless they're drawn by the Father, and well, you didn't do a good enough job drawing me, so how is it my responsibility? I don't know how the Lord is going to reconcile the two of those things. I just know that here, in this life, we need to heed the words of Paul in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 12 and continue to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. That as much as it depends on us, we need to be making our hearts available to God and saying, as best as I can, I surrender myself to you. I give myself to you. I live my life for you. I'm going to put away my flesh and I'm going to feed my spirit. Not everybody could do this. And it says in verse 66, many of those who heard these hard words of Jesus turned away. From this time on, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. And it is really interesting that this is John chapter 6 and verse 66, a number that is associated with apostasy and with everything that is counter to God. Of course, the chapters and verses, as you are probably aware, are not divinely inspired, but it would have taken a lot of forethought, a lot of really weird planning as they were numbering these things to make this happen like this. It almost certainly happened by some kind of divine coincidence. Probably nothing to it whatsoever, but it is interesting that it says that many of his disciples turned away in chapter 6 and verse 66. And you can perhaps imagine how sad this must have been for Jesus, because these people are turning away from what and to what? They're turning away from him, but he is life. So they're turning away from life and choosing death. It's what we have that God presents to the nation of Israel when he's giving them the promised land, and he says, I set before you life and death. Choose life, please. Choose life. And all of these people said, it's just too hard. Probably just going to be easier to just live in comfort here, and then I'll just keep my fingers crossed for the next life, I guess. And it must have broken his heart. And I don't know if you guys know anyone, love anyone, I'm sure that you do, who you see turning their back to Jesus. You see turning their back on God, and perhaps you can imagine the immeasurable pain that is associated with that, of seeing someone who you love and you want them to live, and they are just choosing death. They choose it for themselves. And it's kind of something that I think that we should share, to know the heart of God. We always talk about, kind of, not always, but sometimes talk about and sing about knowing the heart of God. But the heart of God is not always the most comfortable and wonderful and warm place. God, in his heart, he also knows what betrayal feels like. He also knows what loss feels like, what immense grief feels like. So if you want to know the heart of God, then you must experience all of those things. And of course, the great comfort that comes in when you are experiencing those sorts of things, loss and betrayal, sadness, despair, that the Lord has experienced them all too. That you can come to him and he knows what it's like to watch a person who he loves turn away from him and reject him. He knows rejection. He knows betrayal. And it's no wonder, all of this going on, that Judas is mentioned here in the context at the end of this passage, along with the rest who turned their backs on Jesus, essentially betraying him. That Jesus was offering them life. They betrayed him by turning away. And it must have also been discouraging to the 12, seeing so many leave this movement. You can assume that they were thinking to themselves, the more people that show up here, the better, right? It's 5,000, 6,000, 10,000. Look at all the people. This is taking off. This is going to be awesome. And then Jesus stands up and starts preaching, and they're like, oh my God, shut up. Why are you saying this? They're all, look, everyone's leaving. Everyone's leaving. And you can imagine that they're probably quite discouraged. So Jesus looks to them, and he says, he looks to the 12 now in verse 67, and he says, you don't want to leave too, do you? And Jesus' question here almost seems suggestive that the disciples were considering leaving. That the 12 were also considering, well, this might be the end. Everyone seems to have left. And then Peter's response actually almost hints at the fact that they were considering it too. Because he says, to whom shall we go? And it's almost like he had thought about it. Jesus says, you don't want to go too, do you? And he says, well, I thought about it, but where else will we go? There's not really another option. We're kind of stuck with you. And I don't think that that's a really bad way to come to salvation. I honestly think that coming to salvation a lot of times is a running out of options. I almost think that salvation is considering all of the other ways that I could live my life, all of the other ways that I could make it, all of the other things that could bring me peace and joy and happiness, and I consider those things, and I maybe even try them, and it is usually when a person comes to the end of themselves, to the end of their rope, that they say, I guess I don't really have any other choice at this point. That's not everybody's story, I know. Some of you, maybe everything was wonderful and you came to the Lord in the midst of everything being just great. But many of us, it takes really, really getting to the end of all other options before we come to the Lord. And it seems like perhaps that is what Peter is saying here. And while these words are tough, look at how Peter describes them. He says, yes, these are hard words, but they are also the words of eternal life. They recognized the words as being difficult too, the 12, I'm sure. They also said, this is hard. But they said, but at the same time, this is hard, but these are also the words of eternal life. And you remember when we went back to that story where Jesus comes walking across the water and John leaves out the part where Peter gets out and walks on the water too, and it's kind of like, why would you leave that out? That seems cool. If you thought for any reason that John was trying to snub Peter by leaving that out of his account, he more than makes up for it right here, where he shows Peter being a man of incredible and true faith. And you will find no clearer declaration of the deity of Jesus in the Bible than this statement that Peter makes right here. He says, you have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. Everything that John is trying to do in his gospel is to point everyone to Jesus. So he exemplifies who Peter is and what Peter represents, not by what he does in walking on the water, not by his actions, which we have found are trivial in a lot of ways, but by his words, by what Peter says here. And he makes the confession. He says, you're it. You're the Holy One of God. It is only in you that there is eternal life. And where else are we going to go? There's nowhere else to go. He says, where shall we go? And we have come to believe and have come to know. But Peter, speaking for the 12 there, is actually not 100% right. He thinks that they all believe. He's standing there with the 12, and he thinks that they all believe, but Jesus knows differently. And Jesus knows that one of them is not genuine, that one of them is an imposter, or to use Jesus' own words, a devil. He says, there is one in your midst who is a devil, who will betray me, who has seen everything that you have seen, heard everything that you have heard, is even now still standing here and acting as though he is. But he is a devil. This comes to fruition when they are at the Last Supper in the upper room, and they're still remembering this, and they start to ask. And this is where John says that Peter asked the disciple whom Jesus loved, ask Jesus, who is the betrayer? Because none of them knew. And sometimes I wonder if Judas himself even knew. Eventually, at some point, he knew. But I wonder how long it took for him to know. And this is not the wonderful, happy, warm conclusion of this today, but this is, I think, the very practical sort of conclusion that we draw from this text, is that there are people who turn away from Jesus all the time. All the time there are people who turn away. And then there are people who continue and they persist and they stay and they're around and it seems and they act. We see this in Hebrews. It talks about it in a couple different places in Hebrews, that there are people among us who maybe even believe for themselves that they are okay. And the Lord is looking and saying, you are turning your back. And I want all of you to have the confidence and security and peace in your salvation that you don't have to go to bed at night and lay your head down on your pillow wondering. I talked to you about this last week, that I went through a season of my life where I just felt unsure all the time. I'm praying the prayers, I'm having the faith, I feel like I believe, but I don't feel secure. And the Lord eventually gave me security. And now I'll find out one day for sure. But for right now, I feel pretty good about it, and I want for you all to feel good about it too. I just hope and pray that this is not something that is easy for you. If your Christian life is easy, you might be doing it wrong. It is not easy to deny yourself day after day. It is not easy to crucify yourself. It is not easy to give up on all of the desires and ambitions that you have for yourself in order to live for God. It's not an easy thing to do. We're going to have Amanda come and play. And I would just ask you in this time to consider if you are taking the death of Jesus into yourself. If you are walking out what the scriptures say, that if we claim to live in him, we must walk as he did. And I'm not saying this doesn't need to feel like death every day. It doesn't need to be torturous. You don't need to be having a painful, miserable life, but there should be a tension. There should be man, my flesh is really crying out for this thing. And rather than just giving my flesh what it's crying out for, I'm saying no. And it feels like a struggle. It feels like a battle to walk the way that Jesus did, because it wasn't easy for him either. He was God, infinite, omnipotent, all everything, and it was still difficult for him. So if it was difficult for him, we should assume that it's going to be hard for us. I would ask you in this time to consider how perhaps it might be that you might need to die a little more to yourself. That you might need to do a little more to take in the death of Jesus in order that you might live in the life of Jesus. And of course, for those of you who might have people who have just completely and blatantly walked away, not even pretending, not even trying to hang out on the fringes, but they have just turned their backs, that we would use this time to intercede for them as well, that we would pray for them, that you would ask for opportunities to be able to be Jesus' hands and feet and his words to others. And we'll just see what happens as we open our hearts to the Lord. God, we thank you for this hard word, God. It is difficult, and it is uncompromising. So, God, we pray that where your word is hard, that you would make our hearts soft, God. That we would be conformed to your image, God, that we would accept who you are as you have presented yourself, as you have given yourself to us, God, that we would not try to shape you, fashion you into our image, God, but that we would be fashioned into your image. God, may we receive this hard message, God, and may it transform our lives so that we do, as we live in you, we walk the same way that you do, God. Whatever it means for us to be crucified with you, God, may you just bring that to greater revelation in our hearts today. We love you. We ask it in your name. And we do have the communion table set up over here so that you can come and you can commune with the Lord in the remembrance of his body and his blood.